JP, loads to talk about. I made this central to the show yesterday, and I'll make it central again. Justin Welby. I had a sheet yesterday that Ryan gave me about some of the stuff that he's put his nose into over the last few months and years. And this is a man not afraid to speak his mind about Brexit, about slavery reparations, about almost anything, Rwanda. And yet it transpires that he knew about this vile paedophile's actions and the abuse of 132 kids and thought it wise to say nothing. Today is the day where I glorify in what the media does, genuinely, that he's been forced out. It's a good thing, isn't it?
I think it is a good thing. I think it's very sad that it had to come to this. I'm glad that it's not dragged on any longer, because the report that came out last week that's really been the new catalyst for a lot of this must have brought back just the most dreadful memories for a lot of people who were involved. It's high numbers we're talking about. At least, I think, 115 children and young adults involved in this that we know about, and God knows how much more. And goodness knows how many more as well, by the way, when this disgusting animal of a man was shipped off to Africa and shipped around several African countries as well, as if, oh, well, as long as it only happens over there, it's all right.
Not our problem.
Intake, yeah. And so I'm glad that it can be done and those people can sort of heal again, because that wasn't going to happen otherwise. And as you say, a big chunk of this is the hypocrisy. If Welby had been running an amazingly tight ship in the Church of England itself, if he had kept to the important kind of spiritual and moral leadership for which that role, I think, should be its primary focus, and that frankly the country really does desperately need for all the kind of complicated issues that we're talking about. You know, we're going to talk about assisted dying in a minute. It would be amazing to have the most important religious and spiritual figure be able to tell people or teach people how we can go about thinking about such an important topic. Of course, instead of doing that, as you say, he spent all of his time sticking his beak in on all kinds of other issues. I've
actually found that piece of paper, Jay. You love this. He called the EU the greatest dream realised for human beings since the fall of the Western Roman Empire. He linked Brexit to Trump and fascism. He hired numerous staffers from the Labour Party. He then made comparisons of the Rwanda plan to the Nazis and called it ungodly. He likened the climate threat to the Nazis and later had to apologise. He entered talks with MPs to chair a citizens' assembly to stop a no deal, and he complained that the Brexit deal would create a disastrous precedent in the world. And yet all the time, he must have known inside his brain that he kept quiet about John Smyth. Utterly, utterly unforgivable. I would go further. You'll disagree. I think he should be thrown out the House of Lords. I think it is absolutely... You know what? When you pass judgment, and this isn't even a religious comment, people's religion is their business in my mind. When you pass comments so readily, you have to understand that it's going to come back at you. And it has come back on him a shed load, and quite rightly.
Well, look, as the good book says, we tend to notice the little speck of wood in our neighbour's eye and not the great log in our own eye. And perhaps if he'd have read some more of that scripture and maybe read a bit less of The Guardian to get his more temporal opinions, some of this stuff wouldn't have happened. You know, we see in the Catholic Church for a long time now just the most awful, harrowing stories, you know, really a kind of pathological sickness almost there. And you'd have thought that at some point someone would have gone, maybe we should root around a bit more for this. And actually it's worse, because Welby himself was a voluntary dormitory officer at some of these very camps. The idea that, you know, he doesn't know or didn't know anything at all about what was happening has been questioned by some members of the clergy themselves. And, you know, there are some very, very brave priests who've stuck their head above the parapet. You can go into a piece I actually wrote today about an hour before he resigned, so I'm going to claim credit for his resignation. But I've named some of these guys very, very brave to call on your boss to resign because you think it's the right thing to do.
The female Bishop of Newcastle yesterday, Helen, wasn't it? I don't know her second name now, but she came out and she said exactly the same. But, you know, you live by the sword, you die by the sword. I think it's... You're absolutely right to point out that there were many people whose lives were tainted forever that will never recover. And Welby's... He's so good at pontificating. And taking your point about the Catholic Church, I mean, let's look at the real reasons. The Church of England's flock, you have to be very careful trying to say that live, has diminished and continues to diminish. And it is hardly surprising when you look at the way that the Church... Now, I had an argument yesterday with somebody who said, no, it's a Church's right and it's important that the Church talks politics. I'm a bit more basic than that, Jay, right? talk politics, but get your own bloody house in order before you start lecturing everybody else on what you think they want to hear. That, to me, is Labour-esque. That's almost nanny status. If I want to be religious, that's fine, Justin Welby. You know what? Get your house in order, mate, because that was going on and you knew, and that's why you're no longer the Archbishop of Canterbury, in my mind.
Well, again, we just have to go back to Scripture for it. Let he who is without sin cast the first stone. If the Church of England were booming, if there were bums on pews, if people were singing the songs proudly on Sundays and the coffers were groaning with charitable donations, then I would go, you know what, that's a bloke I want to listen to about how to run the country. As it is, many churches are closing, many pews are empty, they are bumless, and many hymns are going unsung, right? And prayers are going unprayed for, and you can see, I would say, as a practicing Christian, that it's something that we could desperately do with a bit more of in this country and in this world. You know, there are complicated ideas like the idea of grace. You know, I've talked about this before. The idea of forgiving people who don't deserve to be forgiven. Let's hope in lots of ways that Welby will receive some of that, because it must be terrible right now. But that kind of idea butts up against other pre-Christian ideas, things like justice or revenge and retribution and these things, and they're complicated issues. The sanctity of life, you know, it's a very sacred idea. It's sacred. All of our language is infused with all of this stuff. How useful would it have been to have had a leader of the Church of England, the most reverend, the archprimate, all these fancy terms? I think we call him the primus inter pares as well, the first amongst equals, all these great terms that could be used for this guy. And God knows we've needed some of that in politics.
Well, it's gone.
Moving it away from party politics, but he's managed to stick his beak into it while his own house was on fire.